once we start thinking of the fact that we're going to die, it really does change the way we behave, and we might not even be aware of it.
Two traders, Darren and Walter, pull back the curtain on profitable trading systems, consistent money management, and profitable psychological triggers. Welcome to the Two Traders Podcast.
In this episode of the Two Traders Podcast, Walter and Darren talk about arguably the most important motivation in your life, which is the idea of death. We'll explain how this may be related to your trading and what you can do to manipulate your thoughts about death to actually improve your trading. All this and more in the Two Traders Podcast. Welcome, Darren, to the Two Traders Podcast. So I understand things are going well in your corner of the world?
Yeah, everything's really good at the moment. Trading's good, feeling sort of positive. Can't really find any negatives at the moment.
Brilliant. So,
what about you?
Oh yeah, it's great. It's springtime and it's really hot. We've got summer weather already here, even though it's not officially summer, and which is like 35 Celsius. So yeah, it's pretty hot. So the beach is getting, and it's also spring holidays here at the moment. So a lot of people at the beach, and there's a music festival in where I live, so there's just the streets are blocked off and just crazy madness. It's sort of a taste of summer, I guess you could say. You know, you can tell it's coming. So yeah, and trading's going well. I've got so there was some there were some concerns on the forum about a couple of trades that I've been holding on to, weekly chart trades I've been holding on to for more than a month, and then another weekly trade that just triggered last week. So I've got 3 weekly trades I'm in, and they're all looking okay. They were looking pretty good. I mean, the one that triggered last week is looking really good, and then one of the other 2 that I've been holding on to is looking pretty darn good as well. And then the other one's kind of, who knows? We'll see what happens on the euro. But yeah, so I'm feeling pretty good about those, and I'm actually pretty keen to take a look at some of the daily chart trades this week. I have a good feeling about this week. I think that there are going to be some support and resistance areas that are going to fail, which gets me excited. I think that we're kind of at that point now in the markets where, I just had a look. I was just on with some traders this morning, and we had a look at some of the indices like the DAX and the FTSE and the S&P 500 this morning, and there's sort of a story that's being told, and I think that it's going to spill over into the currencies. I think we're going to see some pretty strong moves very soon, and that's kind of, for me, for my trading, that's my sweet spot. When the market starts to get a little volatile, that's what I like. I know some traders trade back to normalcy, and when the market gets a little volatile, they make their money when it gets back to normal. But for me, it's the wild swings and when the market breaks out. That's what I sort of live off of. So yeah, so I think we're just getting to the point where hopefully the floodgates open. So we'll see.
Do you think there's kind of a seasonality? I know we were just talking about seasons changing here. Do you think there's like a seasonality in trading as well? Because, we've come out of that sort of summer period now, and we're kind of moving into a different, and it almost feels like the markets are doing that as well. I know last week we were all trading intraday, and we were finding it very difficult because it was like the market had got to the point, right, this is where we decide where we go next now. And do you think that's sort of true? I know a lot of people sort of go deeply into the statistics of, don't trade in August and things like that. And I try to avoid any of that because I find intraday it's not really relevant. But on your longer time frames, would you say it's true?
Yeah, I think typically people say that the markets get quiet. I mean, typically what you'll hear things like it's really exciting in January and it's really quiet in, July, August when people are on holidays in the northern hemisphere. It's not the case every summer, I don't think. Every northern hemisphere summer, it's not the case, but I think that probably if you were to look at it, and I haven't, that more cases than not, more summers than not, you will see more range bound, more sort of tighter ranges, July and August, than you would say in February, January. But I don't know. I haven't looked at the data closely. But that doesn't really mean that. To me, it's sort of like, to me, that's saying don't turn the stove on because you might burn yourself. Well, you can still use a stove and not burn yourself. You just have to stick to the rules, which the rules are don't stick your finger in the flame and so forth. So I think like people say that, oh, July and August are terrible because everyone's away from the markets and it quiets down. Well, then what that means for me is my daily charts aren't going to show any setups, right? And there were some, yeah, you know what I mean? So it's just, as long as I follow my rules, I'm not going to take any setups in what I call traffic, when these daily candles are basically printing on top of each other and there aren't any swing points. So, and I took some flack from some traders saying, hey, Walter, why are you looking at things like platinum and these odd currency pairs? And I said, well, have a look at the pound, have a look at the euro and the Swissy, and you tell me where it's going, whether it's going up or if it's going down. And they're not, right? If you look at those charts recently, they're stuck in a bit of a range, and so that's why I'm not trading the pound or the euro. That's why I'm trading or looking to trade things like silver and platinum, because they're a little bit more volatile and they look completely different to the so-called major currency pairs. So I try to be I try to stick to my rules, and that usually keeps me out of trouble when the market does sort of gear up. You can always drop down to the 1 hour charts and trade if you must, or that sort of thing when it tightens up like that. But I just prefer to manage my trades on the daily time frame. So yeah.
Traders do love that, don't they? Anything with a story attached, they sort of buy into it without really backing it up at all. And don't trade Mondays, don't trade when there's a news announcement coming up, and they kind of end up with basically the only times they're allowed to trade is limited, and they'll often, when they back test, they're not taking note of these issues, and then when they trade live, they like to sort of add them into their strategy. So I try and avoid it, really.
Yeah. I would say when you're doing your back testing in Forex Tester, if you're a discretionary trader and you're not going back and taking a look at which news event came out back in February 2004 when you're taking this trade, then maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe you can go ahead and roll with it when you go live. But yeah, you're right. It's sort of like on your wedding day or whatever, you want to have everything just right, I guess. So everything's just got to be. So when you go live, so typically what will happen is some traders will get really sloppy when they're back testing, and they'll be back testing for 3 hours in front of the computer, and they start growing a beard, and they start getting really they're not as vigilant as they were in the beginning, and so they sort of take any old trade, and then when they go live, it's a completely different thing. Like everything's got to be right. Oh no, there's an interest rate announcement, 3 days from now or whatever, and like you say, they sort of change their approach. I don't think that's necessarily. I understand why people do that, but I don't think it's conducive to duplicating your results in Forex Tester when you go live. I think you should probably try your very best to be as vigilant as possible in your testing, and make sure that you have a list of rules that you're going to use when you go live, and use those same rules when you're back testing. But I understand why people get off center. That makes sense why you would do that. Especially if you're taking too much risk. That's the big one. And what I wanted to talk about today, speaking of risk, is I think I mentioned it the other day, this idea of fear and the motivation of fear. And let me ask you, Darren, if I were to ask you, just put on your psychology hat, and what would be the number one fear that people have? What would be the fear that you think, if you had to choose one as a motivator, what would that fear be? Well,
do you want me to give you my honest answer or my learned answer?
Well, I'd be interested in both. But yeah, what's your your gut? Like, what is it? The number one fear? Yeah.
Yeah, my gut, based on experience, is fear of losing, is the biggest fear. Okay, and that loss doesn't necessarily mean over a period of time. It's the actual loss itself, the individual loss is the fear. But from what I've read from people who know more about this than me, it's fear of missing out and fear of future regret. But yeah, for me personally, it's fear of losing.
I think you're onto something. So I think what you're saying kind of fits in with where I was hoping to take today's session, which is about this theory. A friend of mine. So I as you know, I've spent a lot of time at university and stuff like that, and ended up going and getting a PhD in psychology. And I have this friend who's a really interesting guy, and to give you an idea of what he's like, he actually was very anti-smoking, and he said to all of his friends, "You're ridiculous if you smoke. You're so stupid. Why don't you just quit?" And they said, "It's just not that easy. You can't just quit. It's a really difficult thing to do." And so what he decided to do was he would start smoking so that he could quit, and to show them that, it's not that hard to quit, right? And when he did it, when he started smoking, he smoked for a couple of months, and then he quit and said, "See, that's really easy." And they said, No. You haven't really been a smoker. You need to smoke for longer than 60 days to really get it. And so he did. And then he moved to Japan, and because cigarettes were so cheap over there, on principle, he just kept smoking. And when he finally decided it was time to quit, he understood exactly what his friends were talking about back home in Canada. They said, it's like losing a friend. And that's exactly what it felt to him. It felt like he had lost this friend. And it wasn't only the physiological aspect of it. It was like that time that you had smoking on your own was gone. And he said to them, "Okay, now I get it. I get what you're talking about." And the reason why I bring him up is because he asked me a very interesting question. We used to have these talks out surfing or whatever, hanging out at the pub. And he said, "Hey, Walter," because he didn't go to university. He went straight into the working world right after high school. And so he said, "What was the coolest thing that you learned when you did your PhD in psychology?" And I thought it was a really interesting question because no one had asked me that before. And of course it would come from him. It's one of the reasons why I like these talks with you, Darren, because you're a bit like him. I'm attracted, and I like to spend time with people who have a different point of view. This sort of thing where you don't just spout off what you've been told, but you actually think for yourself, right? That's one of the things I like about this podcast. But so he said, "What was the most interesting thing you learned?" And I had to think about it. And I said, the most interesting thing I learned was this theory that I learned toward the end of my psychology studies, and it's called terror management theory. Anyone who's interested in of this idea should definitely Google it and definitely have a look. The theory goes like this. The biggest concern for people is the idea that you are going to die, and whether or not you're going to exist after you die, whether or not that's it, kaput, you don't exist anymore, you cease to exist. And so the biggest fear, according to terror management theory, is the fear of death. And so what terror management predicts is a series of very interesting and counterintuitive predictions based on whether or not someone has considered the fact that you are going to die. So they use this thing called mortality salience. So they essentially remind you of the fact that you're going to die. So they might have you in these experiments write down, your own obituary, or write down your thoughts about death, or they might even just ask you a few questions next to a cemetery. So it's kind of just almost not quite subconscious, but it's just a subtle reminder. So they might ask one group next to a cemetery and another group next to a park or something like that. So this idea of terror management is that because it's such an incredibly daunting and really unsettling thing to consider, your own demise, that we come up with these basically two umbrella strategies to cope with this. The first is that we align ourselves with our worldview, which is in essence our culture. And the second is that we try and pump ourselves up. In other words, we try and increase the importance that we give to ourselves. In other words, we try and increase our self-esteem. So by managing our allegiance to our culture or our worldview, or by essentially pumping ourselves up and making us feel better, we're able to better block out this idea that we're going to die, because it's sort of like a way of saying we're going to keep existing even after we die because we're a part of this great country, or we're a part of this great subculture. Maybe you are you're a professor of physics, so even though you're going to die one day, there are other professors of physics and perhaps your students that will live on and continue on your research or that sort of thing. Does this make any sense at all, Darren?
Possibly. You're saying basically we've all got this fear of our mortality is a big thing for all of us. It might not necessarily be obvious to us, and that will affect how we act in certain situations. Yeah.
And I can give you tons of examples, because as it turns out, in psychology, typically what happens is people will hone in on a very, almost like a micro aspect of our lives. And so, for example, there might be a theory about how people interact with their friends, okay? And so some psychologists will look at social relationships in the friend domain and how you relate to people that are your peers. And then there'll be a whole another group of people that will look at how people interact in sort of the family unit. And so those will have like separate theories, okay? And so psychology has, because it's such a new science and it's difficult to study people, it's run into a lot of critics who say, well, there really aren't any theories of anything. And even the best theories of behavior, like the overarching ones like Freud's, have their own problems because they can't, essentially Freud's theory can't be tested. It's an untestable theory. So the interesting thing about this theory is that it can be tested, and it is sort of an overarching theory. And so there are some predictions that it makes. So let me give you, I can give you a few examples here some of these are really funny, but in this study, basically they had some people that were to act as judges, okay, like in a legal case. Okay, so one group of judges was given subtle reminders of their death. They were given a questionnaire. Okay, they're both given a questionnaire, but in one group, there were subtle reminders of their death in the questions. And then they were asked to review a case about a prostitute. And they said, now you suggest a bail amount for this prostitute. Now the group who had received the subtle reminder of their death in their questionnaire came down more harshly and said that the bond should be $455 on average, whereas the control group who had the same questionnaire but removed the death reminders in the questionnaire, this is very subtle, right? They only thought she should pay $50 bail, okay? So the idea here is that when you are reminded of your death, when you have that mortality salience, right? When that switch is turned on, you align yourself to your worldview. And in this case, the judges in this case believe that prostitution is wrong and in this culture. And so therefore, they came down more harshly on someone who violated the cultural norm, which is, you shouldn't be selling sex. So that's one example of how just by being suggested that you're going to die, you actually do something different than you probably would have otherwise. And that's what the control group showed. Now, as traders, it's a little bit tricky because they've actually looked at terror management theory in terms of risk-taking behavior. And here's where it gets interesting. Remember we said there's two things that reminding yourself of death will do. One is you kind of want to grab onto your beliefs about your culture. Now, for me, I remember I used to get, when I was getting to the point where I was going to defend my dissertation in psychology, I started getting these panic attacks. And the first one I had was I remember it was the Olympics, the Summer Olympics. And I woke up in a cold sweat, and I must have watched the gymnastics Olympics that evening, I think. And that night I woke up and all I kept thinking was, as my heart's beating and it's going really fast, I think I'm going to have a heart attack and die. I kept thinking of, we won gold. in the women's Olympics. That was so important to me. I was like, I kept thinking that I was overjoyed that we won gold, even though I was, clearly going to die this night, And I think of that when I think of terror management, how silly that I was thinking about this 16-year-old girl that sealed the gold for the U.S. gymnastics team when I was about to die of a heart attack. And so, but this is the sort of thing that we see. They've done tests with people who are making risky decisions, okay? Like divers. They've done divers, and they say, okay, We want to see if these scuba divers are going to take risky decisions, make risky decisions based on whether they've had this reminder of the fact that they're going to die. And what they found was if you had high self-esteem, so you felt really good about yourself, if you were reminded of the fact that you were going to die, when you went out scuba diving, you wouldn't make risky choices. Now, but those with the lower self-esteem actually did make more risky choices when they were reminded of the fact that they were going to die. Now, if they weren't reminded of the fact that they were going to die, it didn't matter. It didn't matter whether they had low or high self-esteem. They would have the same number of risky decisions and risky take risks. Now, so remember, we talked about this. There's two things that you hold on to. One is your culture, and the other is you try and pump yourself up. So it turns out that it seems as though people with lower self-esteem are more prone to risky decision-making if they're reminded of their death. Now, they've looked at another thing, which is post 9/11 in New York. Okay, so after the World Trade Centers went down in New York, they examined different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And what they found was people who came from poorer backgrounds were actually more likely to do things like buy a whole bunch of lottery tickets after the World Trade Centers went down, and people who had come from a higher SES background and have more money actually became more risk averse. So the idea here is that the people who had essentially low money self-esteem, right, going into this reminder that they're going to die, started getting more risky. And the other people that essentially had, basically, for lack of a better term, they had higher self-esteem about their money and their self-worth in terms of dollars, they would take less risks. So again, it kind of fits into the big picture here of terror management, and I just wanted to throw it out there because I thought that some people might be interested in this and thinking in terms of how can you set yourself up as a trader so that you're aware of the fact that let's say that maybe you're from a poor background and you see trading as a way out of that. That's your ticket out of this. So is there something that you might be able to do to set yourself up so that you aren't breaking your trading rules, so that you aren't being too risky with your systems and your decisions?
Did they test the same idea with other fears or just the fear of death?
Yeah, the idea is basically based on I think it was an anthropologist book. I think it was Becker, but he basically posits this idea that, most of what motivates us is the fact that we are aware subconsciously that we're going to die. And so the psychologists took it, and for the last 30 years, they've been testing this thing, and they've essentially said, we've come up with all of these situations where you would normally predict one thing to happen, but something else happens if you use the magic bullet, which is, again, subtly reminding someone of the fact that they're going to die one day. So it really is the death salience that changes the behavior here. It's sort of the magic bullet, as it were. And they've done things where, not only they couldn't figure out in New York why so many people were buying lottery tickets after 9/11. And when they looked into it, they saw it was the poorer people that were just going hog wild and buying a lot of lottery tickets. And then they did studies too. They said, would you, the classic economic study where they say, would you take a sure $10 or a 50-50, flip of the coin, and you either get nothing or you get $20, right? So they do those sorts of things, and they've done it in many different ways, and they found that, again, if you've got low self-esteem or if you've got basically little money, right? So I call it money, money self-esteem, right? So economic self-esteem, whatever you want to call it, your background. If you're coming from a poor background and you're reminded of your death, you're going to be more risky. All things being equal, you're more likely to take risks. And if you're from a more wealthier background and you're reminded of your death, you're actually going to get more conservative than you would normally be. So it's just kind of a way of seeing, your motivations in a different light. I know a lot of people probably don't even want to think about this.
Yeah.
which is sort of the point. Yeah.
Add me to the list. Well, because at first hand, you think, well, you're not often being reminded of that anyway, but actually we are. You know, if you've got the TV on and you're reading the papers and you're listening to the news, we're kind of, you know, constantly being reminded of that. You know, there's constantly wars. You know, it tends to be bad news, doesn't it? You know, they don't report the crash where everyone was all right. They report the horrific one where everyone died just going to work or whatever. So we are always being reminded of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The other day, there was a shooting in the U.S., and everyone, of course, comes to me because I'm the token U.S. guy over here in Australia. And they're like, you know, oh, I can't believe it, another shooting in the U.S., you know. And it's just, and you're right. I mean, that's what sells the headline. Those are the headlines that sell. They don't talk about the family that's taken in 12 orphans and they're just struggling to get by, and they're, you know, they're the saints of the neighborhood. They're talking about the guy that walks in and shoots a bunch of people on campus. So you're absolutely right. And then they talk about famous so-and-so who's famous has got cancer now, or so-and-so's died, or, you know, there's a lot of that's going on in terms of, you know, what we're getting bombarded with if you're looking at the mass media. And so they're just telling us that there is this motivation here that's inside us, and you should be aware of it. You know, if you're a person who is interested in your own psychology and even more so interested in this idea of death and considering your death, it could be something to get into. And I just wanted to highlight it because I just thought it was fascinating. You know, they have all kinds of stories. You can find them on the internet. Like there's a study where they use hot sauce, and they see how much hot sauce people pour into someone's meal when knowing that the person doesn't like hot sauce when the person's not looking. And again, it's related to the fact of whether or not they've been reminded of their own death and how that fits in with their stereotype of this other person. So it's just a broad range of studies, hundreds and hundreds of studies that have basically come up with ways, very creative ways of confirming this idea that once we start thinking of the fact that we're going to die, it really does change the way we behave, and we might not even be aware of it. You know, and what's interesting and we could probably talk about this some other time, but what's interesting from a neurological point of view is they can put an MRI on your head, okay, and they can tell you 6 seconds before you make a decision. The guy watching your brain scan can tell you, he knows 6 seconds before you say what your decision is, he knows what you're going to do. And that's because he can see that in your head. And we come up with reasons why. I mean, this all gets into priming, and I think we've touched on it, but we can come up with reasons why we're doing something that actually have nothing to do with the actual reason why we're doing it. It's just a justification post hoc, right? And I know this is kind of one of your big themes, isn't it? Especially when it comes to trading, you know, we can come up with all these reasons why this spot on the chart was the perfect spot for the reversal, especially when that reversal happened 3 months ago, you know, that sort of thing. And the indicator's turning yellow or whatever, you know, that sort of thing. But yeah, so interesting thing to look at. I know, you know, for a lot of us, you know, the gut is, oh, well, I don't have to worry about this because I have high self-esteem, or this, you know, death doesn't worry me, or whatever, things like that. But the theorists are basically saying that a lot of what we do in everyday life is a way of hanging on to immortality by proxy, essentially, by associating with what we view to be important. You know, our worldview, our culture. And they would argue that culture itself is just a way for us to maintain our, you know, immortality by identifying with a group, a subgroup, a country. It doesn't necessarily have to be your country. It could be like your subgroup. Maybe you are like I said, like a scientist, or maybe you are a pilot, or maybe you are a Marine, or whatever, you know. These are the sorts of things that maybe you grew up in a commune. So you believe that, you know, that's something that's very important. You know, I know a guy who grew up in a commune, and he talks about how that was actually the normal way to grow up years ago. It's only recently that we've, in the Western world, sort of come up with these little family units. Before, it was everyone grew up in a commune, you know?
Well, that's pretty mind-blowing stuff, that. I mean, it's along those lines of the priming that I just kind of touched on the other week, and I'd only seen a short example video about it. I know I've got issues with money, and I never knew that before. Trading has taught me that about myself. because, you know, I didn't come from a wealthy background, and when I sort of look back on, you know, how I deal with money, definitely got issues with money. But if I talk about my mortality, it's not something that instantly worries me or I'm concerned about. So it's just kind of making me think, really, now. I am quite risky.
Right, yeah. What's going on?
I'm not particularly risk averse. But I'm changing on that as well. You know, there's certain things now that before I was a trader, I would have just done without considering it, but now I do sort of consider the risk involved, like bungee jumping, etc.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, being a parent will do that too. You know, maybe I shouldn't bungee jump, or maybe I shouldn't jump out of that. You know, go skydiving, or wear my squirrel suit through the Grand Canyon, or whatever. You know, whatever people do. You know, a lot of people say, like yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say I'm definitely going to look more into it.
Yeah. It'd be interesting. I want to get back into priming. I think, you know, I've been reading up on some of the psychology and the experiments in priming, and I find it fascinating. And I think we should definitely do an episode on priming where we look at that, because I think that's a very fruitful area.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So, okay. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, the seed for the terror management theory came from Ernest Becker's 1973 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, nonfiction book called The Denial of Death. And Becker argues that all human action is taken to ignore or avoid the anxiety generated by the inevitability of death. So all human action is taken to ignore or avoid the anxiety generated by the inevitability of death. So that's the basic idea. Certainly have a look at either Ernest Becker's book, Denial of Death, or you can just Google terror management theory and you'll see some of the interesting experiments that have come up. I like the hot sauce one myself, but it's something to think about, guys, and you can probably use this if you are aware of, if you can see this, if you can see this in yourself, you can use it as a tool, just as you can use priming as a tool to help your trading. And I think we should probably talk about that in another episode, Darren. We get deep into priming and what this means for us as traders, and how, you know, priming can be used as a tool, as a risk management tool, if you know how to do it. So I think that would be another good episode that we could jump into, because I know that's a big one for you as well, that the idea of priming. So
yeah, I'd like to do more on the priming, and you know, it specifically, and how we can kind of set ourselves up for trading and use it for our sort of trading routine.
Brilliant. Let's do it. Okay. Have a good day, Darren. We'll talk to you in the next episode. And thanks a lot for your time.
Okay. Cheers, Walter.